The night Red Hollow nearly burned to the ground, nobody talked about what really started the fire. They talked about the outlaws. They talked about the gunshots and the broken glass and the 3 men who rode out before dawn with blood on their boots. They talked about Sheriff Calhoun lying face down in the dirt outside the Silver Thread Saloon, a bullet in his shoulder, and his pride in ruins. But nobody talked about Clara Voss. Nobody talked about what she did that night. What she decided. What she gave up, and what she chose to protect instead. For 7 years, Clara had kept her feelings buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they weren't there. 7 years of watching, waiting, saying nothing. 7 years of being the quiet woman behind the counter at Hale's General Store, the one who remembered every face, every name. Every whispered conversation in that dusty little town at the edge of nowhere. She saw things other people missed. She always had. But seeing things and doing something about them, that was a different kind of courage entirely. When the riders appeared on the ridge at sundown that October evening, Clara was the first to notice them. 3 silhouettes against the sky the color of dying embers. She recognized the shape of the man in front, the way he sat a horse like the world owed him a debt. She knew that man. And she knew what his arrival meant for Red Hollow. The question, the one she'd been running from for 7 long years, was finally standing in her doorway. Was she going to let him walk in? Or was she finally going to do what she should have done the night her father died? Red Hollow sat in a shallow valley between 2 dying ridgelines, the kind of place a man might pass through and forget before he'd ridden another mile. The town had maybe 300 souls on a good day, traders, ranchers, a handful of miners who still believed the hills had something left to give. Main Street was nothing more than packed earth and stubbornness, lined with buildings that leaned into each other like old drunks keeping each other upright. Clara Voss had lived here her entire 29 years. She knew every warped plank, every loose hinge, every face that came and went. She knew which men drank to remember, and which ones drank to forget. She knew which marriages were happy and which ones were held together by nothing but routine. She knew things about Red Hollow that Red Hollow didn't know about itself. What Red Hollow didn't know was anything real about her. She stood behind the worn pine counter of Hale's General Store, counting bolts of fabric she'd already counted twice, when the bell above the door announced a customer. She didn't look up immediately. Force of habit. Let them come in, let them settle, let them reveal what they actually needed before they told you what they wanted. Evening, Miss Voss. The voice belonged to Deputy Ethan Cole. Young. 24 at most, with an earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide what was behind it. He removed his hat when he spoke to her, always did. She noticed that the first week he arrived in town 2 years ago and filed it away as either genuine respect or calculated charm. She still wasn't entirely sure which. Deputy, she said, finally looking up. Store closes in 20 minutes. I know it. He set his hat on the counter and ran a hand through sun-bleached hair. Wanted to ask you something before you locked up. Ask then. He hesitated. Another thing she noticed about Ethan Cole. He hesitated before the things that mattered. It wasn't weakness. It was the kind of pause a careful man made when he understood the weight of words. You hear anything today? Strangers through town, anyone asking questions about the county road north? Clara kept her expression smooth. She'd spent years perfecting that smoothness, laying it over her face like plaster over a cracked wall. She thought about the 2 men who'd come in just after lunch. They'd bought jerky and hardtack and 2 boxes of ammunition. One had a scar that pulled the left side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. The other had said nothing, just watched the door the entire time they were in the store, watching it like something was going to come through it that he needed to be ready for. She noted the brands on their horses through the window. Brands she'd seen before, a long time ago, in a different life. No, she said. Quiet day. Ethan studied her for a moment. He wasn't as unobservant as he appeared. Sheriff Calhoun got word from Millville this morning. Thinks the Doyle outfit might be working their way south through the territory. The name hit her like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move through her, quick and cold, and she held herself perfectly still while they passed. Doyle, she repeated, as if the name meant nothing special. Wade Doyle. You know the name? She began folding a length of blue calico, her hands moving in the deliberate, rhythmic way they always did when she needed to keep them occupied. I know the name the way most people do. By reputation. Which was true. In the same way that a woman might know the name of the thing that killed someone she loved without ever knowing it would one day ride into her town and give her the chance to answer for it. Sheriff wants everyone to be careful. Keep their eyes open. Ethan picked up his hat, turned it in his hands. You live alone, Miss Voss. I just want you to know, if you see or hear anything that troubles you, day or night, you come find me. She met his eyes then. Fully, directly, which was something she rarely allowed herself. He had honest eyes, this young deputy. The kind that hadn't been lied to enough to learn to doubt what they saw. That was exactly why she couldn't tell him the truth. I appreciate that, she said. Good night, deputy. After he left, she stood motionless in the quiet of the empty store for a long moment. Outside, the sun was finishing its descent behind the western ridge, painting the dust of Main Street in shades of rust and old gold. Beautiful, the way only dying light can be. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. And there, at the far end of town where Main Street curved toward the livery stable, she saw them. 3 riders coming down off the ridge road. 3 silhouettes against the last burning colors of the sky. She knew the one in front. She'd know him in the dark, in a crowd, at 1,000 yards. She'd been carrying the shape of him in her chest like a splinter for 7 years, small enough to ignore most days, but always there, working its way deeper. Wade Doyle had come to Red Hollow. And somewhere underneath the cold dread that moved through her, beneath the fear and the anger and the old grief she'd never properly buried, there was something else. Something that scared her far more than any outlaw ever could. Relief. 7 years ago, Clara Voss had a different name. Not legally, she'd always been a Voss, but in the way that really matters, the way a person becomes something entirely new when the world breaks hard enough. She'd been a different kind of woman entirely. She'd been the daughter of Robert Voss, one of the most respected cattlemen in Cutter County. She'd been the girl who could outride most men on the ranch, and who read every book that came within 50 miles of the property. She'd been engaged, briefly, to a man named Thomas Hale, the original owner of the store she now worked in, nephew of the man who'd hired her after everything fell apart. She'd been happy. Or close enough to it that she hadn't known to appreciate the difference. The summer she was 22, Wade Doyle's gang had moved through Cutter County like weather. They weren't the worst outfit operating in the territory at the time. There were men who burned and men who murdered for sport, but Doyle had a particular talent for destruction that left no room for recovery. He targeted ranchers specifically. Took their cattle, their cash, their credibility. He had a way of ruining people that was almost surgical. He didn't always take everything. Sometimes he left just enough to make a man think he might survive, and then he came back for the rest. He came back for Robert Voss in October of that year. Clara had been in town when it happened. A supply run that took 3 hours longer than it should have because Thomas's horse had thrown a shoe and they'd waited at the smithy. 3 hours. Sometimes she still turned that number over in her mind, wondering what would have been different if the shoe had held. When they returned to the Voss ranch, the cattle were gone. The ranch hands were gone. The money her father kept in the iron box beneath the floorboards, savings from 20 years of hard work, was gone. Robert Voss was not gone. He was sitting in his kitchen chair, very still and very pale, with a single gunshot wound in his right hand where he tried to stop them from taking the box. He'd survived the wound. What he hadn't survived was the collapse that followed, the debts he couldn't service, the land he had to sell, the absolute and total dismantling of everything he'd built. He was dead within 8 months. The doctor called it his heart. Clara called it something else, something that didn't have a clean medical name. She'd seen Doyle that day. Only briefly, through the kitchen window, before Thomas had pulled her back. But she'd seen his face clearly enough. She'd burned the image into the back of her memory and kept it there, carefully preserved, for exactly this kind of moment. Now she sat at the small table in her room above the store, listening to the sounds of Red Hollow settling into its evening rhythms. Horses at the livery. The low murmur of voices from the Silver Thread Saloon 2 doors down. Someone's dog barking once, twice, then going silent. She had a decision to make. Several, in fact, but they all funneled down to one central choice that she kept circling without landing on. She could go to Sheriff Calhoun tonight. Tell him what she knew, not just that Doyle was in town, but that she'd seen his men in the store that afternoon, that they were armed and stocked for something bigger than a passing night. Calhoun was a capable man. Aging, maybe more cautious than he'd once been, but capable. He'd want to know. The trouble was what came after that. Doyle was smart. He'd survived this long because he was smart. If Calhoun moved on him too early, or without enough men, Doyle would simply ride out and come back in a different form. Another month, another name, another town that didn't see him coming. He'd done it before. He was exceptionally good at escaping consequences. But if Clara waited, if she watched and listened first, she might learn something. What they were planning. Who in town had let them know it was safe to come? Because someone had. Towns didn't just appear on an outlaw's map by accident. Someone had spoken for Red Hollow. The idea that there was a traitor inside the town she'd spent 7 years quietly learning had not been far from her mind since she'd seen those brands on the horses this afternoon. She stood and moved to her small window, looking down at the street. The Silver Thread's front door spilled warm yellow light across the boardwalk. She could see shapes inside through the gap in the curtain. Men at the bar, men at tables, the ordinary comfortable disorder of a saloon on an ordinary night. Except nothing about tonight was ordinary. Because inside that saloon, if she was reading the signs correctly, was the man who had destroyed her family. And he didn't know she was here. He had no idea that the quiet woman running inventory at the general store had watched his face through a kitchen window for 7 years inside her memory. He didn't know that she had never, not for a single day, stopped thinking about what she owed her father. Clara Voss pulled on her coat, the dark one, the one that didn't catch lamplight. She checked the small revolver her father had given her on her 16th birthday, the one she'd carried every day since his death, loaded and ready, a habit so old it had become part of who she was. Then she went downstairs, slipped out the back of the store into the alley, and moved toward the sound of voices and music and the particular kind of laughter that hides what men are really feeling. She moved quietly. She was very good at that. At being present without being seen. She'd had 7 years of practice. The Silver Thread Saloon was the closest thing Red Hollow had to a heart. Not a kind heart, more like the unpredictable, occasionally violent kind, the kind that beat too fast when trouble was near and went dangerously quiet when it passed. Bill Archer ran the place with the efficient disinterest of a man who'd seen enough human weakness to stop being surprised by any of it. He poured good whiskey and kept a sawed-off shotgun behind the bar and didn't ask questions he didn't want answered. Clara had never been inside before. Women came to the Silver Thread for 2 reasons in Red Hollow, work or desperation, and she'd spent 7 years being neither. Tonight she was something else entirely. She came in through the side door, the one the kitchen staff used. Slipping past the cook without making eye contact and positioning herself in the narrow space between the kitchen doorway and the end of the bar. From here she could see most of the room without being easily seen herself. The noise and the smoke and the heat of the place wrapped around her like a physical thing. She found them almost immediately. They had a table in the back corner, the best tactical position in the room, back to the wall, clear sight lines to both doors. 3 men that she could see. The 2 who'd come into the store, and a third she hadn't seen before, older, with a gray-shot beard and the patient, Settled quality of a man who'd been dangerous for so long he no longer needed to perform it. That was Wade Doyle. She recognized him the same way you recognize something from a dream, imprecise but absolutely certain. He was older than she remembered from that distant glimpse through a kitchen window. Heavier in the shoulders. Deeper lines around the eyes. But there was the same quality to him, the same gravitational weight of a man who expected the room to arrange itself around his needs. He was talking to someone across the table. Someone she couldn't see, blocked by a support beam and the angle of her position. She shifted slightly, careful, and caught a glimpse of a hand resting on the table. A familiar hand. She'd seen that ring before, a flat silver band on the middle finger of the left hand. The kind you notice because the person wearing it had a habit of tapping it against surfaces when they were thinking. She'd seen it tapping against her own counter just this afternoon. But the ring hadn't been on the hand of either of Doyle's men. It had been on the hand of someone else. Someone who'd come in separately, just before closing, buying nothing, just standing and chatting about the weather and the condition of the road north. Someone she'd spoken to 100 times. Someone she would have trusted without thinking about it if she'd been anyone other than who she was. Frank Alderman. Red Hollow's postmaster. Married, father of 3, deacon at the First Methodist. 30 years in this town. He was sitting at Wade Doyle's table. Clara pressed herself back against the wall and made herself breathe slowly. The betrayal of it moved through her in a hot wave, not surprise exactly. But the particular sick feeling of watching something click into place that you'd half known was there all along and hadn't let yourself fully see. Frank would have known everything Doyle needed. Mail routes. Payroll schedules. Which ranches were understaffed, and which had money in the bank. Which lawmen were competent, and which ones were coasting. He'd have known that Sheriff Calhoun's deputy roster was down to 2 men after the summer sickness took most of his force. He'd have known that Red Hollow was, at this particular moment, about as vulnerable as it was going to get. She needed to hear what they were saying. She needed to get closer. This was, she understood clearly, an extremely dangerous thing to consider. She was one woman with one revolver in a saloon full of men, trying to get close enough to eavesdrop on a conversation between an outlaw and his contact inside town. If she was recognized, if she spooked them, if anyone from Doyle's camp had been in the store that afternoon and remembered her face, then she thought about her father. About the iron box with 20 years of savings. About a man in a kitchen chair, very still, very pale, with a wound that wasn't the one that killed him. She moved. She found the blind spot. There was always a blind spot, in rooms and in people, and worked her way toward it. She circulated into the main floor of the saloon like she belonged there, keeping her face angled slightly down, staying in the drift and flow of bodies moving between tables. She made herself small. She'd spent years making herself small. She got close enough. Before the payroll wagon comes through Thursday, Doyle was saying, his voice low and flat and utterly unhurried. You sure about the route? Frank Alderman's voice, barely above a whisper. Same as it's always been. They won't change it. Calhoun doesn't have the men to escort it differently. And the town itself? A pause. Clara held her breath. Leave the town alone, Frank said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't expected, something that almost sounded like a line he was desperate not to cross. A border he'd drawn in himself and kept approaching. That wasn't part of, I'll decide what's part of it, Doyle said. Pleasantly. Terribly pleasantly. Silence. Thursday, Frank said finally. Quietly. The sound of a man who'd already lost the argument with himself a long time ago, and was only now hearing the result. Clara backed away. Carefully, steadily, the way you back away from something dangerous in the dark. No sudden movements, no sound, just controlled and deliberate retreat. She made it back to the side door. Through the kitchen. Into the alley. Into the cool night air that hit her face like cold water. Thursday was 2 days away. The payroll wagon that came through Red Hollow every other week carried wages for 3 ranches and the county road crew, close to $4,000 in cash and coin. And if Doyle had decided to stop being careful about the town itself, $4,000 was the least of what Red Hollow stood to lose. She stood in the alley and understood, with the total cold clarity that comes from the intersection of old grief and immediate danger, that she was the only person in Red Hollow right now who knew all of it. Every piece. The question was what she was going to do with that knowledge. She went to Ethan Cole's door at 9:30 that night. It wasn't a decision she'd arrived at easily. She'd walked for an hour through the back streets of Red Hollow in the dark, turning it over, coming at it from different angles, trying to find the version where she handled this alone and it ended well. She couldn't find that version. She was honest enough with herself to admit when she'd run out of road. The deputy lived in a rented room above the saddle makers, accessible by an exterior staircase on the building's north side. She climbed it without making noise. She was, as established, very good at that, and knocked 3 times, quietly. She heard him move immediately, which told her he'd still been awake. The door opened and he was there, fully dressed, hand on his sidearm until he saw her face. The gun hand dropped. Miss Voss. Genuine surprise, and something behind it, the specific quality of a man recalibrating rapidly. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. He studied her face for a moment in the dim lamplight that came from somewhere inside. Whatever he saw there made him step back and hold the door open. Come in, he said. She told him. All of it. Not the part about her father, not yet, but everything from the afternoon, the 2 men in the store, the brands on the horses, the way they'd watched the door. What she'd seen in the saloon. The conversation she'd heard. Frank Alderman's name came out of her mouth with the flat weight of something she'd rather not have had to say. Ethan had kept his word. He'd listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the silence was the kind that has texture. She watched him processing it, watched him deal with the Frank Alderman of it specifically, the way his jaw tightened and then deliberately released. How close were you? He asked. When you heard them. Close enough. I don't misremember conversations. He believed her. She could see it. She wasn't sure yet if that was good instinct or dangerous naivety on his part, but she'd take it. We need to go to Calhoun, he said. I know. But you need to understand something first. She kept her voice even. This was the part she'd been working out during her hour of walking, and she needed him to hear it correctly. If you go at Doyle directly, if you try to arrest him tonight or move on him before Thursday, he'll walk. He's got horses saddled or I'm not standing in your room at 9:30, and he did not survive this long by making it easy. You'll spend 3 days trying to catch a ghost and Thursday will come and that wagon will still get hit. Ethan was quiet. Thinking. She watched him be good at it. This was what she appreciated about him, the pause before the answer, the refusal to just react. So what do you suggest? This was the moment she'd been building toward. The moment she'd decided on in the alley outside the Silver Thread, standing in the dark with her father's revolver at her hip and 7 years of patient, careful knowing finally pointed at something she could use. The wagon, she said. Change the route. Move it earlier. And let me help you plan it. Because I know where they'll position themselves based on what I heard, and I know this county's back roads better than anyone in Red Hollow short of the men who've been here 30 years. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, in the direct and slightly unsettling way he occasionally had. Why do you know the county roads better than anyone? She met his gaze and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, because I pay attention. Will you go to Calhoun with me or not? Another pause. Then he reached for his hat. Let's go. They went to the sheriff's house, not the office. Less visible that way, less chance of being seen by the wrong eyes. Calhoun answered the door in his nightshirt with a lamp in one hand and the expression of a man who'd been half expecting bad news and was now deciding how angry he was about being right. He listened to Clara with a different quality of attention than Ethan had, not distrust exactly. More like the habit of a man who'd been lied to by credible-seeming people before and had developed a permanent filter for it. He asked her 2 questions about what she'd seen and heard, specific detail questions designed to catch inconsistency. Her answers were precise and without hesitation. He sat back in his chair. The lamplight threw deep shadows across his face. "Frank Alderman," he said. Not a question. More like a man reading his own name on something he didn't expect. "Yes," Clara said. Calhoun closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the sentiment was gone. What was left was the working part of him. "All right. Here's what we're going to do." The plan that emerged over the next hour was not exactly what Clara had suggested, but it was close. Close enough. Calhoun had constraints she hadn't fully accounted for, legal ones, practical ones, the particular limitation of a law office operating with 2.5 deputies and no budget for surprises. But he was a craftsman with what he had. The wagon would move on Wednesday morning instead of Thursday. The route would change. And Frank Alderman would be quietly, carefully watched between now and then, not arrested, not confronted, not given any indication that the walls were moving. Because if Frank panicked and warned Doyle, the whole thing evaporated. Clara walked home alone through the dark, quiet streets of Red Hollow, listening to the town breathe around her. She felt something she hadn't felt in years, not peace exactly. More like direction. Like a compass needle that had been spinning loose finally settling on a bearing. What she hadn't told Calhoun. What she hadn't told Ethan. What she hadn't told anyone. Was that she wasn't finished yet. Rerouting the wagon, catching Doyle on the wrong road, sending him to a territorial prison, that was justice of a kind. The kind with paperwork and judges and bars. But there was another kind. One she'd been carrying for 7 years like a stone in a coat pocket. And she wasn't sure yet which kind she was going to choose. She wasn't sure she'd decided. And that uncertainty frightened her more than Wade Doyle ever had. Wednesday came in gray and cold, with a thin wind off the ridge that pushed dust along the street in low, restless spirals. Clara opened the store at the regular time, moved through the regular motions, spoke to the regular people who came through. She sold Mrs. Hartley 4 yards of muslin and a card of buttons. She listened to old Pete Donnelly complain about his knee and the quality of the last batch of coffee beans and agreed with everything he said. She was present, and she was absent simultaneously, her face in one place, her entire mind somewhere else entirely. At 10:30, she saw Frank Alderman cross the street toward the post office. He moved normally, she thought. Unhurried. If he suspected anything, he was doing a passable job of not showing it. But she watched the way he held his shoulders, tight, slightly elevated, the body carrying what the face refused to, and she knew the anxiety was there, just below the surface. Where a man keeps the things he can't afford to examine in daylight. She thought about going to him. Sitting across from him in the post office and asking him, plainly, why? Not to help the law. Not because it would change anything at this point. Just because she genuinely wanted to understand what a man in Frank Alderman's position had told himself to make what he was doing feel survivable in his own mind. What story a person built around that kind of choice? She didn't go. She had other things to be. At noon, Ethan came by under the pretense of buying tobacco, a habit he didn't actually have, which she noted, filing it as information about the kind of man he was. He set the coins on the counter and spoke without looking at her directly. Wagon left before dawn, he said quietly. Southern route through Cutter Pass. Calhoun's got 2 men with it he pulled from outside the county. Nobody local knows the route change. Doyle's men will be in position on the North Road, she said, equally quiet. Above the creek crossing. The tree cover's good there. That's where Calhoun figured. Ethan finally looked at her. How'd you know about the creek crossing? I grew up in this county. He seemed to want to say something else. The pause was long enough that she thought he was going to. But he just nodded, pocketed the tobacco he bought for appearance's sake, and left. The afternoon crawled. She counted inventory she didn't need to count. She swept a floor that wasn't dirty. Outside, Red Hollow moved through its ordinary Wednesday motions, and underneath all of it, under the dust and the commerce and the entirely normal appearance of a normal day, something was coiling tight. At 3 o'clock, Frank Alderman came into the store. She saw him and felt the whole architecture of her composure test its own load-bearing points. He came in looking slightly distracted, slightly pale around the mouth, and asked for nothing in particular, just browsed. The way people do when they need to be somewhere specific but can't make themselves go yet. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He ended up at the counter. He set down a single can of peaches, something he hadn't come here for. She'd bet her life on that. Quiet day, he said. Quiet enough, she agreed. He looked at her. Frank Alderman was not an unintelligent man. She'd always known that. His eyes were doing something complicated behind their surface. You look tired, Clara. You sleeping all right? Fine, she said, and gave him the change for the peaches and nothing else. He left. She breathed. At 4:15, she heard the shots. Not close, 3-4 miles north of town, carried thin by the wind but unmistakable. She'd grown up around gunfire. She knew the difference between a hunter's rifle and something with stakes behind it. She stood very still in the middle of the store and listened to the silence that followed. At 5, Ethan came back. This time he didn't bother with the pretense of buying anything. He came in, saw her face, and said, It's done. The wagon? Made it through fine. They waited on the north road like you said? He exhaled slowly. Calhoun and 2 deputies were waiting for them. 2 of Doyle's men in custody. One ran there tracking him. Clara was quiet for a moment. And Doyle? The pause told her before the words did. He wasn't there. He sent 3 men and stayed back. She'd suspected this was possible. Doyle had survived this long for a reason. Smart men sent scouts, sent proxies. Smart men didn't ride into the trap themselves. Where is he? We don't know yet. She looked past Ethan, through the store window, at the quiet street outside. She thought about a man who was smart enough to not go to the creek crossing. She thought about what a smart man does when his plan has gone wrong. He doesn't run immediately, not Doyle, not a man with his history. He figures out how the information leaked. He traces it back. And the only people who'd known the full picture, the route, the timing, the change, were Calhoun, Ethan, 2 outside deputies, and Frank Alderman. Frank didn't know the wagon had moved, which meant when Doyle figured out the trap, he'd look at Frank. He'd look hard at Frank. You need to get to Frank Alderman, Clara said, already moving toward her coat. Right now. Tonight. She beat Ethan there by 30 seconds. Not because she ran, she didn't. She walked fast and deliberately through the early evening streets toward the post office, which was dark, and then toward Frank Alderman's house, which was also dark in ways it shouldn't have been at this hour. No lamp in the kitchen, no movement behind the curtains, the particular stillness of a house that has recently emptied. The front door was slightly open. She stopped on the porch. She could hear Ethan's boots on the boards behind her now, coming up fast. Her hand went to the revolver at her hip, her father's revolver, loaded, ready, the habit of 1,000 ordinary days and this one extraordinary one. She pushed the door open with her left hand and went in. Wade Doyle was standing in Frank Alderman's parlor. He was alone. Frank was in the corner by the fireplace, alive, standing, but with the terrified frozen quality of an animal that's done the math and doesn't like the answer. Doyle's gun was holstered. He hadn't needed it yet. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, the gun available but not drawn, the posture of a man who was having a conversation, not ending one. He looked at Clara. The recognition wasn't immediate. She wasn't what he was expecting to see. But he was a man who processed rapidly, adjusted rapidly, and she watched him do it, watched his eyes move over her, over the revolver in her hand, over the absolute steadiness with which she held it. "Well," he said in that same flat, pleasant voice she'd heard through the noise of the saloon. "This isn't the deputy." "No," she said. "It isn't. You going to use that, or are you just carrying it for show?" Behind her she heard Ethan come through the door, heard the sound of his gun clearing leather. "Doyle. Hands where I can see them. Now." But Doyle wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at Clara. At her face. And something in his expression had shifted, something careful and recalculating, the look of a man who has noticed that the most dangerous person in the room is not the one wearing the badge. "You're a Voss," he said. It wasn't a question. The sound of it, her name in his mouth, was the strangest thing she'd felt all day. Stranger than the fear, stranger than the anger, stranger than everything. Because it was confirmation. He knew who she was, which meant some part of him had always known this moment existed somewhere in the territory of his future, waiting. "Robert Voss was my father," she said. Silence. Frank Alderman made a small sound in the corner that no one paid attention to. "I remember him," Doyle said. "I know you do." Ethan, trained and disciplined and choosing to read the room correctly, held his position and didn't speak. He understood something was happening here that existed outside his jurisdiction in the most human sense, a space between two people where the official world had not yet intruded. This was the moment. The one she'd been carrying for 7 years. Wade Doyle in front of her, close enough that she couldn't miss. Her father's gun in her hand, loaded and steady. Ethan behind her, a witness, a law officer, a good man who would have to report exactly what he saw. She thought about her father in his kitchen chair. She thought about 8 months of watching a man diminish. She thought about the iron box and the 20 years it represented and the absolute, irreversible nature of what had been taken. And she thought about something else. Something she hadn't expected to think about, standing here in Frank Alderman's dim parlor with a gun in her hand. She thought about the kind of woman she wanted to be on the other side of this moment. She'd spent 7 years hiding. Hiding her feelings, her history, her real self behind the smooth plaster face of the general store woman who knew everything and said nothing. She'd built that hiding place out of grief and anger, and the specific paralysis of not knowing what to do with what you carry. She told herself it was patience. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. What she understood now, with complete and terrible clarity, was that there is no version of this moment that gives you back what you lost. There is no shot that unburies an iron box. There is no justice precise enough to equal grief. The question was never what Wade Doyle deserved. The question was always what she was going to do with the rest of her life. She lowered the gun. Not fast. Not dramatically. Slowly, deliberately, the same way she did everything, with total intention. She holstered it and looked at Doyle and said very quietly, "He was a better man than you'll ever understand." Then she stepped aside and let Ethan Cole do his job. Doyle went with less resistance than she'd expected. Maybe he'd known, when she lowered the gun, that she'd made the harder choice, and something in him, not respect, she wouldn't give him that, but recognition, understood what it had cost. He let himself be cuffed. He walked out of Frank Alderman's house without looking back. Frank was taken too, quietly, the way Calhoun had wanted, no spectacle, no public accounting. That would come later, in a courtroom, in the way things are supposed to come. His wife and children were not home tonight, which was mercy, or luck, or some small, specific grace that this particular evening had decided to offer. Clara walked home alone. The streets of Red Hollow were quiet. That thin wind had died. The sky had cleared while everything else was happening, and it was spectacular now, the full spread of stars over the desert, The kind of sky that makes you feel small in a way that is, strangely, comforting rather than frightening. She stopped in the middle of Main Street and stood there for a moment, alone in the quiet. She felt the weight differently than she expected. She thought lowering the gun would feel like defeat, or like surrender, or like one more thing she'd failed to do for her father. It didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like setting something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. 7 years of hidden feeling. 7 years of a face she'd plastered over everything real. 7 years of living in Red Hollow as a partial version of herself, useful, observant, invisible, sufficient, but never full. She was still grieving. She understood that grief didn't have a clean ending, didn't resolve when the man responsible was in handcuffs. That was the thing about grief that nobody tells you clearly enough: it outlives its causes. It just lives in you, becoming part of your structure, the way a healed bone is stronger at the break. But she was also, for the first time in 7 years, entirely herself. She heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She knew the particular rhythm of them. "It's late," Ethan said. "I know." He came and stood beside her, not too close, exactly the right distance for a man who understood the difference between being present and being intrusive. They looked up at the stars together for a moment in the way that people do when they've been through something and the regular language for it hasn't caught up yet. "You could have shot him," he said. Not an accusation. Barely even a question. "Yes. Why didn't you?" She considered giving him the full answer, the real one, the one she'd arrived at standing in that parlor with her father's gun in her hand. She decided he'd earned it. "Because my father didn't raise someone who lets the worst thing that happened to her become the most important thing about her," she said. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then, "I think you've been in this town for 7 years and nobody in it actually knows you." She looked at him then, sideways. "The way you look at something you're not ready to look at directly but can't quite stop yourself from looking at." "No," she said. "They don't. Maybe that should change." She said nothing. But she didn't look away either. And in Red Hollow, with the stars thrown wide overhead and Wade Doyle in a cell and Frank Alderman's betrayal waiting for its morning reckoning, and 7 years of buried feeling finally breathing open air, in Red Hollow, on this particular night, not saying anything was the same as saying yes. Wade Doyle was tried in the county seat the following spring. Convicted on 7 counts, including the attack on the Voss Ranch. The territorial judge gave him 23 years. He would be 64 when he walked out, if he walked out at all. Frank Alderman pled before trial. His family moved away quietly that winter, before the snow came, before the town's feelings about it had fully hardened into something they couldn't walk back from. His wife, by all accounts, had not known. Whether that's true or not, nobody in Red Hollow felt entirely certain, and that uncertainty became one of those things a town carries in its collective chest, pressing quietly on certain days more than others. Sheriff Calhoun's shoulder healed, the one he'd taken in a scuffle during Doyle's arrest, a detail he downplayed to such an extent that most of the town didn't know about it until weeks later. He was that kind of man. Clara Voss stopped hiding. Not all at once. Not dramatically. She didn't change her name back or put a sign in the window or make some grand announcement about who she really was. But she stopped wearing the plaster face. She started letting people see the real one, the sharp one, the complicated one, the one that noticed everything and had opinions about most of it. The one that could be hurt. It turned out Red Hollow was more comfortable with the real Clara Voss than she'd given it credit for. Most people are more comfortable with authenticity than we expect, because most people are also hiding something, and it's a relief when someone else stops pretending first. She and Ethan Cole had coffee together on Thursday mornings. That's how it started. Thursday morning coffee at the back table of May's, before the store opened and before his shift properly began. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in the companionable silence of two people who'd realized, without quite announcing it, that they fit together in some functional and important way. Nothing was declared. Nothing needed to be. Some things between people exist before they have names. She visited her father's grave in October, on the anniversary. She'd done it every year, but this year was different. This year she went without the weight of the unsettled account pressing on her chest. She brought wildflowers because he loved them, and she sat with him for a while in the autumn quiet and told him about the year and about what she'd chosen and why. She thought he would have approved. She thought he would have said something like, "The hardest victory isn't the one over your enemy, Clara. It's the one over yourself." She sat there a long time, in the yellow October light, with the wind moving through the dry grass around the marker, and the wide sky overhead and all of Red Hollow spread out in the valley below her. She thought about the kind of quiet that comes after something is finally finished. The kind that isn't empty, not the quiet of absence or avoidance, but the deep, solid quiet of a story that has reached its proper ending. The quiet that has room in it for what comes next. She thought about 7 years and everything she'd kept inside them. All the feeling, all the knowing, all the watching from behind smooth plaster walls. All the mornings she'd opened a store that wasn't hers, and all the evenings she'd gone back to a room above it, and all the years in between. She thought about one night in Red Hollow. One night that had pulled all of it to the surface like water finding its way out of rock. And she thought about a man's face across a parlor, and a gun in her hand, and a choice. And she thought about lowering it. She put her hand on her father's marker, the plain, honest stone with his name and his dates and nothing else, because some men don't need poetry on their graves, their lives having been sufficient testimony, and she pressed her palm flat against it, and held it there for a moment. "I'm all right, Papa," she said. The wind moved through the grass. She stood. She put on her hat. She started back down the hill toward Red Hollow, toward the store and the coffee and the Thursday mornings and whatever careful, honest, hard-won thing her life was still becoming. 7 years is a long time to carry something alone. But the weight of it, once you finally set it down, turns out that's what your hands were for all along.